After last week's class, Father Terry Somerville, one of our priests here at St. Peter and Paul, asked me if I knew how many martyrs had been killed during the period of the Roman persecutions. And as I did not know the answer, I know that a figure was given to me many years ago when I was studying church history. I tried to find it in both ancient and contemporary sources, but could not do so. So if any of those either listening now or who will listen in the future are church history experts and have access or know an approximation of the number of martyrs, perhaps it can be made known. I do know one thing, however, that's apt for our own century, and that is that more people have laid down their lives for Christ in the 70 years of the Soviet period in Russia than in the entire previous Christian history. So that's to remind us that the age of martyrs is by no means restricted to those 3 centuries of persecution by the Roman Empire. It continued on and will continue on till the end of the world. This evening we have reached the 4th century, and although it can be said of every period in the church's life and every place, there's always a great deal to be said, there's a lot that happens. Nevertheless, so much happens in the 4th century that determined what follows up to our own time that it probably will be impossible to cover it all in one session. We're going to have to speak of, first of all, the conversion of Constantine, Emperor Constantine, and the relationship between the church and the Roman state that followed upon that conversion. We're going to speak of the state of the church within herself in the 4th century, and that means speaking of the worst of the difficulties that the church had to face, the Arian controversy, and the 2 councils that addressed that controversy, what we call today the First and Second Ecumenical Councils. We're going to have to speak of the very great figures involved during that period. That includes those 2 councils and the period between it from 325 to 381. And that means the great Saint Athanasius and the Cappadocian Fathers, Basil the Great, Gregory the Theologian, and Gregory of Nyssa. We will have to speak of the first emergence and development of the church's worship that took place in this century that remains formative to our own time. And we're also going to have to speak of something else very significant that happened during this period, and that is the great growth of monasticism and the ascetic life. So you see lots of things in the 4th century. In the year 306, Constantine, and if you recall from last time, who was the son of a man named Constantius Chlorus, who was the second in command to the Western Emperor Maximian. Remember that the empire at this time was ruled by 2 co-emperors. It was Diocletian in the east and Maximian in the west. They each had 2 sidekicks, as it were, Maxentius in the east and Constantius Chlorus in the west. By the way, at this time, it's useful to know that the emperor was no longer proclaimed emperor by the Roman Senate, as had been the case previous to the end of the 3rd century. Now, the emperor is proclaimed emperor by the army. So that introduces a new and very significant factor in how a Roman emperor becomes emperor and how there can be a number of claimants to the throne. The Roman emperors did not follow hereditary lines. They did usually for perhaps 2 or 3 generations, and then somebody else might be proclaimed emperor. It was all up to the army, who the army was going to proclaim. So Constantius, the father of Constantine, dies, and Constantine is proclaimed by the army in the West, the Western emperor. And the first thing that happens is that Constantine and the emperor in the West, Galerius and Licinius, those three, proclaim what is called an edict of toleration. And that means in the year 306, in theory, the Christians and anybody else, as a matter of fact, is given the right to worship. And that does not mean, however, that the persecutions cease. What happens is that they cease in the West, but in the East, because particularly Maxentius is such a hater of the Christians, they continue on sporadically for another several years. When we look at the figure of the Emperor Constantine, how he rose to power and his always sympathy, he had a sympathetic attitude toward the Christians, as we said last time. His mother, Helen, was Christian. First of all, the first period of his life as emperor begins with the consolidation of his power in the West. He had a foe. He had another one who wanted to be emperor instead of him that he had to deal with, a man named Maxentius. And the crucial battle that occurred, in which Constantine became the sole emperor of the West, and it's very significant, happened on October 28th in the year 312. It's called the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. The Milvian Bridge is outside of Rome. And there Constantine met Maxentius. And on the night before the battle, all the early histories claim Constantine had a vision in which he saw, not as sometimes is described now, but he saw, not the cross, but he saw what is called the chi rho, which are the first two Greek letters, the chi, like an English X, and the rho, which looks like an English P. And those of you who know when that X and rho or P are superimposed, that they form those two letters, they are the first two letters of the Greek word Christos. So they are one of the early Christian symbols. That Constantine had a dream or a vision the night before this battle, when he saw these letters in the sky and was given the message to have those letters inscribed on the battle standards, and that he would conquer Maxentius. Sometimes this dream or vision is confused with one that Constantine claimed to have had a few years earlier when he was fighting Gothic or Germanic tribes up north, and he saw a vision of the cross and the words in Latin that he heard or supposed that he heard, in hoc signo vinces, in this sign you will conquer. And so as a result of this vision or dream, Constantine did what he saw, and the next day, against enormous odds, Maxentius had a much larger army, Constantine defeated him and became the sole emperor of the West. Constantine always attributed his victory to the intervention of the God of the Christians. That is how he always understood it. From that time on, even though, and we're going to speak of this later, even though he did not actually receive baptism until shortly before his death, he regarded himself as a Christian. Now, his victory and how his victory took place were interpreted in various ways by various people. When the triumphal arch was built in Rome shortly after Constantine's victory, it was not built at that time in honor of Christ, but it was built in honor of the sun god, the unconquered sun. Worship of the sun god by Romans, and particularly by the Roman army, had become quite popular. It had come from the East, and in the 3rd century became very common. So Constantine's victory was attributed by many not to Christ. However, by Constantine himself, he regarded his victory as the God of the Christians showing him favor. And from that time, he became a protector and patron of the church. Now, in the year 313, now Constantine is not yet the one single emperor over the whole Roman Empire. There's still the emperor in the west to deal with, Galerius with his Caesar Licinius. But in the year 313, what is called the Edict of Milan was issued. And we're going to speak of now a series of proclamations and Roman laws in which you can see first the toleration, then the increasing patronage and favoritism that was given by the empire to the church. This Edict of Milan in 313 gave to the entire empire absolute freedom of religion. That there were no more prohibited religions. Finally, the anti-Christian laws, which had been in the books since the 2nd century, were repealed and discarded. Also, all the Christian property that had been confiscated during the final great persecutions was restored to them. But still, at this time, there was no proclaiming of Christianity as the established religion of the empire. Rather, toleration was given. But all of the pagan official practices of Rome still went on. And Constantine, even though he regarded himself as Christian, though not yet baptized, still had to function as the Roman high priest of the imperial cult. Now, in the year 319, another law is passed which begins to show some favoritism to the Christians. The clergy are exempted from taxation and military service, and even more significantly, private sacrifices to the old gods of Rome are prohibited. And then in the year 324, Constantine finally defeats his last rival from the east, Licinius, and he becomes the sole emperor of both the Eastern and Western Empire, which there hadn't been one for the best part of, half a century. The empire had been split, but now Constantine becomes sole emperor again. And then the laws continue. In the year 320, work on Sunday in the cities is prohibited. Sunday is made a day of rest. And that's very significant because it's not commonly understood, but the Greek and Roman world did not have the week as a basic rhythm of time. The observance of the week comes from Israel, and its existence to our time is part of our inheritance from the Jews. In order to have a week as a basic unit of time, you have to follow a lunar calendar, because each lunar month is more or less 4 weeks. And the Greco-Roman calendar was a solar calendar, so the week, even though they knew of it, was a way of counting time that was not, it didn't affect your day-by-day work and cycle. So this is the first time that the Christian measure of time, the week, it comes into prominence, and the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, though in the law still there's this resistance from giving an overt patronage of Christianity. It says that there won't be any work in the cities on the venerable day of the sun. It does not yet say the Lord's Day. But it's from this time that the 7 days of the week, there's an attempt which is successful in the East, not so successful in the West, to no longer call them by the names of the planets and the moon. You know, Saturday from Saturn, etc., Monday from the moon. And instead to simply give them a number. And in Greek and Latin, that's what happened. Sunday was called Kyriaki imera in Greek, the day of the Lord, or Dominica in Latin, the same thing. And the rest of the days were simply called second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day. In Greek, Friday acquired the name Paraskevi, which means the day of preparation, and it acquired that from Good Friday, the preparation of the Passover, the day before the Passover. And Saturday, of course, Savaton from 7, but also having the connection to the Jewish Sabbath. And that's what prevailed in the Greek and Latin languages with the coming into Christianity of the northern peoples, the Germanic peoples. In the Germanic languages, there was a return to the old pagan names of the days from the planets or pagan gods. But in Greek and Latin, the week with the Lord's Day at the head becomes the primary unit of time. The courts also at this time are closed on Sunday, with one exception, that you can go to court if you wanted to set your slaves free on Sunday, because the setting free of slaves was accounted as an act of piety. And there we can see certainly Christian influence, that even though slavery was not abolished, and there really wasn't an effort to abolish it as an institution by the church at any time, beginning from the scriptures onward, nevertheless the setting free of slaves was always counted from the very beginning as a pious act, a blessed act, something that someone who wanted to follow the gospel with their whole heart was encouraged to do. In the year 330, Constantine decides that he wants to build himself a new capital city. And on that peninsula that is called the north of Anatolia, north of Asia Minor, the new city of Constantinople is built between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean on those straits, the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, which was a very crucial point for trade then. So it's built on top of an older city called Byzantium. And from that old city Byzantium comes the adjective Byzantine, which is used to describe the Roman Empire from Constantine on, but it's not an old word. The expression Byzantine Empire is an invention of 19th century historians who began it as a convenient way to describe the Constantinian period and that which followed. But at the time, it simply went on as the Roman Empire. So a new city is built which does not have a pagan past, as the old cities of the Roman Empire do. Now, we have here, therefore, a dramatic change in the life of the church that occurred in a very short time. And it's no surprise that it took the church some time to get used to this. What does it mean now that the Roman emperor, the most powerful person in the then known world, in the Roman world, the one who previously had been worshipped as God, for whom oceans of Christian blood were shed out of refusal to worship him as God, now the Roman emperor is not only no longer persecuting the church, but regards himself as a Christian, even though he is not yet in sacramental union with the church. And that itself is a problem. How does the church, as it were, digest the Roman emperor? It wasn't an easy question. In fact, the fact that Constantine delayed his baptism till shortly before his death was indicative of the times, because Constantine, the Roman emperor, was not the only person who did this. In the 4th century, there began a practice, and those who were involved in this practice, some of the great fathers of the church, Basil and Gregory and some of the others, who were not baptized as infants, make it clear that this delaying of baptism that became common in the 4th century was not the early tradition of the church. Rather, it's something that began at that time as a sort of reaction to the very stringent penitential discipline that we talked about in the past session, that if one should fall into grave sin following baptism, the penance that was assigned before someone could be received back into communion with the church was many years, sometimes to the rest of your life, for the rest of your life. And even Christian parents, sometimes very devout Christian parents, such as the parents of St. Basil the Great, who we're going to talk about shortly, were afraid that their children, especially their sons, who lived a more public life at that time than the daughters, and who, if they were of wealthy families, were going to be sent away to schools that were not necessarily Christian schools or run with Christian influences. They feared that particularly their sons might fall particularly into the sin of fornication. And as a result of that, if they had been baptized in their infancy, would have to spend most of the rest of their life as penitents. So there began this practice of delaying baptism. So Constantine, how was Constantine the emperor, whose private life was by no means, if it's examined, in accord with the commandments of God at this point, who also had to still keep up the whole Roman imperial cult, who had to condemn people to death? And this was a real issue. It was not at all clear to the church at that time whether it was possible for someone to be a member of the church and still be imposing death sentences on criminals and killing people in battle, and sometimes using torture and other such things. Wasn't clear that could be done as for one who's a member of the church. So Constantine delays his baptism and regards himself as he has himself enrolled as a catechumen, but remains that for basically the rest of his life. Now, as we spent a good deal of time last time talking, the state of the church at the end of the persecution is a study in contrasts. That on the one hand, there are these heroic martyrdoms. It is the age of the martyrs. And as Tertullian, the 3rd century teacher, says, the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. The more martyrs' blood is shed, the stronger the church becomes. And that's true on the one hand. On the other hand, we saw that the age of the martyrs does not prevent all sorts of problems within the church, all sorts of divisions within the church, all sorts of heresies arising not from outside, although there's that too, but also from within the church. And that leads us to another point, I think very important whenever we discuss this period of the conversion of Constantine and the growth of a relationship between what we would call church and state that had not existed until this time. Some people regard this time in the church's life as the beginning of everything going downhill. That the church is now going to be increasingly regulated, this viewpoint says, by the state, and therefore compromised, and therefore the church loses its purity, becomes manipulated by those seeking the aims of this world, the aims of the state, and becomes increasingly concerned with the acquisition of political power and wealth. And therefore, this viewpoint goes on to say that beginning with Constantine, the golden age of the church is over. Well, any examination of the first 3 centuries of the church's life, as we've tried to do in some reform up until this week, will show us that there is no golden age of the church. Or perhaps to speak more accurately, there is a golden age of the church. It lasted for 50 days. From the resurrection of the Lord through his ascension to Pentecost. And as we said before, the church has always been wanting to get back to that, and will get back to that at the end. But once those 50 days ended and Pentecost came and the Holy Spirit came down and the apostles went out into the world, then the golden age of the church was over. Because nothing has ever been perfect since then. As we know, whether it's the age of the apostles and their troubles and controversies and divisions in the early church, the Jewish church, and from then on, both from inside and outside, the church is always, there's one of the early fathers uses a Latin expression, in statu via, in statu patria. That means on the road. It's a church on a pilgrimage, on the road to the fatherland. And the fatherland is heaven. Life in this world is not heaven. And the church's life in this world, although the church is the vehicle provided by God by which heaven becomes present in this world, yet it is not a heaven perfectly attained as long as the church is in this world. So, this idea that somehow the church had a period of perfection while it was being persecuted, but once the persecutions ended, entered into a period of compromise with the state, is really more a result of imagination of a supposed golden age than any fact. As a matter of fact, the church at the end of the persecutions was riddled with all sorts of internal difficulties, as we spoke about last week. Trouble with those who had lapsed under the persecutions. Trouble from those who were increasingly teaching doctrines contrary to the original apostolic faith. And that's where we have to turn next. That in the city of Alexandria, whose bishop was a man named Alexander, and he had a deacon named Athanasius, there was a very popular priest whose name was Arius. And we must not imagine, because not only Orthodox Christians, but all those Christians who have an understanding of the historical development of the church and who uphold the apostolic faith that Christ is truly God and truly man, Arius is not a name held in blessed memory. Yet we must not imagine Arius to be some sort of immoral man or villain. Arius, in fact, was immensely popular among the people of Alexandria because of his priestly ministry there. He was a good preacher. He took care of the poor. He went down to the docks where the poorest people in Alexandria lived. He preached to the dock workers there and the sailors. He taught them songs. It said that he was very good looking, very handsome, so people were attracted to him. And in the songs and in the sermons that Arius preached and sang, he said some very disturbing things. He said that there was a time when the Father was alone. There was a time when there was no Son of God. That the Father created the Son as the first of his creatures. That the Son was made out of nothing like the rest of creation was. And of course, this began to be, when it reached the ears of Bishop Alexander and the deacon Athanasius and many others, was very disturbing. Yet, to other people who heard this, it was very appealing. And that's, if one wants to understand the Arian controversy, that's what's central, that to many people at the time, this this way of presenting who Jesus Christ is. And as we're going to speak now for the next several sessions about this period in the life of the church, when the question concerning who is Jesus Christ, which is the center question of the gospel, who do men say that I am, it's going to occupy all of the first of the great councils of the church. And there were some for whom this description of Jesus Christ as an intermediary between God, the Creator, and creation, someone who is on the one hand more than a human being. Arius did not say that Jesus Christ was merely a human being like us. He was the first of God's creatures and a kind of God, Arius said. Godlike. So he was, we could say in Arius's view, a sort of Superman, more than mortal, but on the other hand, not equal to the Father, not sharing the same essence as the Father, having a beginning in time, unlike the Father, who of course has no beginning in time. Now, the people for whom this view of Christ was appealing were people who had been formed in a view of gods. The gods of Greek and Roman mythology were exactly that. They were half divine, half human beings, products of men's imagination. It was much more easy to understand, sounded much more familiar than a person whose identity was so much of a mystery that it was incomprehensible. How could someone be both fully God and fully man? So this reduction of the apostolic faith, as the church always understood it, was very popular. Furthermore, as we spoke last week, there was a number of false teachings that had become common in certain areas that were not unlike the teachings of Arius. There were those, for example, that said that Jesus was a creature but was adopted as Son of God at his baptism. They are called the adoptionists. And then on the other hand, there are those that said, well, if you say that the Son is of the same nature of the Father, sounds like two gods to me. And since there's only one God, we can't say that the Son of God is God. So, and then on the other hand, we have those that said the Sabellians, who claimed, the modalists, who claimed that the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit were just the same person showing himself in different ways. But there's only one God and only one divine person. So one had all this confusion regarding who is Jesus Christ in the church that emerged from the persecution. And this is what Emperor Constantine found on his hands when he decided that he was the protector of the church and a Christian. Now, Emperor Constantine was a Roman soldier, Roman general, with a practical approach to life. He was what we would call a politician. He knew the value of people being united in what they believe. But we should not understand that the Emperor Constantine's motives in the influence that he had in the 4th century church were dishonorable ones. Sometimes one hears this approach to Constantine, that he was a kind of political manipulator, saw that Christianity was the way to go, that in many areas of the empire already by far the majority of the population was Christian, and had a kind of predisposition to it inherited from his mother. So he thought that the best way to consolidate his power as emperor was to patronize the church. the only trouble with this viewpoint is that nobody at the time of Constantine himself, no witness writing from the 4th century, has that viewpoint at all. Everybody presents Constantine as being very sincere in what he does. His faith remains a very simple faith. And so all of these theological controversies were foreign to this Roman soldier who is now the sole emperor of Rome. But Constantine recognizes that there has to be in the church order, and now that he is the protector of the church, he decides that the way to have order in the church is to summon a council. So the first great council of the church, the first of the councils that is called ecumenical. There had been other councils of the church before it, regional councils happening in various areas of the church here and there. First one being the meeting of the apostles in Jerusalem, described in the Acts of the Apostles. And there had been councils in other places through the first 3 centuries. But this is the first council where all the bishops of the church are invited to come. And Constantine invites them to, of course, it's the year 325. Constantinople is not built yet. So he invites them to the city of Nicea, which is in Asia Minor, close to where Constantinople would be built. And the entire First Council is financed by the government, and he treated the bishops royally. Now, what an amazing thing that must have been, if you stop to consider it. Some of the bishops that came to the First Council had been in prison in the persecution. Some of them came without a leg, without an arm, without an eye, from the tortures they had received at the hands of the Roman state. Now they are the honored guests of the Roman emperor, all in less than a generation. You see what an amazing change it was in the life of the church. So 280 of them come. Most of them are from the Greek-speaking areas of the church, what we would call the eastern half of the Roman Empire, whether Egypt or Antioch and the Near East, Palestine, Asia Minor, Greece. And then a fewer number come from the West. And a custom begins at that time, which was continued ever after at the great councils of the church. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope of Rome, does not come in person, but he sends 2 priests, his legates or his representatives, to come in his place. And their position there is always regarded with great reverence, because they are the representatives of the Bishop of Rome, who is in the church at this time understood as the successor of the apostles Peter and Paul. Not in a sense in which the other bishops are not also equally successors of the apostles, but as the Roman church is the church in the first city of the empire and has this venerable tradition reaching back to the deaths of Saints Peter and Paul, so the representatives of the Bishop of Rome are given the first place at the council. Now, what Constantine wants is he wants these bishops to provide the answer for all of these controversies going on in the church, because they are politically disturbing. The Christian populations are not necessarily peaceful over these questions. That in fact there are sometimes riots that break out. The city of Alexandria is notorious for its riots, but that's not the only place. Between those who are maintaining what would be understood as the traditional doctrine, and the Arians and the others like them. So Constantine wants this council to come up with a statement of faith that everywhere in the church will be followed, will express the faith of the church. And one of Constantine's favorite bishops, a consultor as it were, is a bishop named Hosius from the city of Cordova in Spain. And it is this bishop, Hosius, that comes up with a very significant Greek word, and that word is homoousios, or in English, of one essence with the Father. The statement that Christ is of one essence, of the same essence of the Father, or in Latin, consubstantia, consubstantial with the Father, that is at the center of the declaration of the First Ecumenical Council, and the word is first used by this bishop, Hosius of Cordova, and it's presented to the council, and for the most part, everyone likes it. There's some debate over it, though, because it's a new expression. It's something that had not been used up to this time, whether in the scriptures or in the early writings or in any of the texts of the church's worship. So it's a newcomer. So a decision has to be made whether it should be adopted despite its untraditional use, had not been used, and should be used as a tool to more articulately, more clearly express what the church believes. And it is adopted. And as you know, the creed, the statement of faith that we call the Nicene Creed, although the way that the creed is said in the church now is more developed than the creed that comes from the First Ecumenical Council. The creed that comes from the First Ecumenical Council has the crucial statement that is to ensure the apostolic teaching, what had been central to the life of the church to begin with, that Jesus Christ is not a creature and has no beginning in time. He is light of light, true God of true God. He is begotten, not made. That means that he comes forth from the Father. He is not made out of nothing, like those things that are created or fashioned. Rather, he is begotten from the Father himself, and he is of one nature, one essence, rather, homoousios with the Father. And then the Nicene Creed goes on in the words that are familiar to us, with this exception. When it comes to the Holy Spirit, it simply ends. It says, and we believe in the Holy Spirit, period. No more. All the rest of what we know in the Nicene Creed comes later. And then it adds certain anathemas. An anathema, you know, is actually a curse upon those who do not hold the faith of the church. It says, if there are any who hold that there was a time when the Son did not exist, or if there are any who hold that the Son was created in any way, let them be anathema. So everyone at all the 280 bishops, with the exception of 2, sign the creed. And the reason why the 2 didn't sign it didn't have to do with anything in the creed itself. Other decisions were taken also at the First Ecumenical Council, because this issue of making the statement against the Arians was so central. A lot of times people are not aware that there are other decisions that were made in this council too, regarding interior government and affairs of the church, how the date of Easter was to be determined. This is the council that clearly upholds that the Lord's Day, that Easter, Pascha must be kept on the Lord's Day, how it is to be reckoned. It's not to be kept on the same day as the Jews. And then regulates that bishops are not to be transferred from one place to another place. It's from this council that we receive the tradition that we do not kneel for prayer on the Lord's Day or the 50 days from Pascha to Pentecost. We stand as a sign of the resurrection, indicating, incidentally, because standing on Sunday and standing during the 50 days of rejoicing was considered the exception. The rule was to kneel. Sometimes if one looks at contemporary church practice, because unfortunately in 20th century, especially in North America, the majority of Orthodox churches have only the Sunday services, that when weekday services are held, the only posture that people are used to now in the church in many cases is the Sunday posture, which is meant to be the exception. And people have forgotten how central kneeling has always been as an expression of Christian prayer from the beginning. It's interesting, by the way, virtually every mention of prayer in the Acts of the Apostles, for example, they're kneeling. And kneeling was actually the characteristic Christian posture of prayer. But anyhow, those sorts of things come from the First Ecumenical Council, and the reason why the two bishops of Ethiopia did not want to sign the Acts of the First Ecumenical Council is they also decided that the Church of Ethiopia's affairs were going to be regulated by the city of Alexandria in Egypt. And the Ethiopian bishops didn't like that, and they said, no, we're not going to sign anything. But everybody else signs not only the creed, but also the canons, the rules established by the First Ecumenical Council. As a result of this council, therefore, Arius is excommunicated. He had already been excommunicated by his bishop, Alexander, but the excommunication is declared by the entire church. Arius and those who follow him are cut off from the communion of the church. And also, because this council, after all, has been summoned by the emperor imposes a penalty upon Arius, and that is he is put into exile, is banished. So this is the first example of a long history that certainly does have its unfortunate side of difficulties in the church being solved through political means. What I said earlier about Constantine and the church was by no means meant to obscure the fact that this cooperation of the church and the state had and continued to have, up until our own times, many great difficulties. That the church that had been used to regulating its own affairs and seeing itself as an assembly removed from the political systems of this world now has the Roman emperor in its midst. And Constantine even came to, especially at the beginning, came to many sessions of the council, though after a while he got tired of listening to the bishops talk about all these theological terms, so he had them make a special little door right behind his throne where he could go in and out without being heard and not create any bother. But nevertheless, so that's the result of the result then of the First Ecumenical Council, is that the traditional faith that Jesus Christ is of one essence with the Father, and that new word of one essence is adopted by the Council. He is of the same nature as the Father, light of light, true God of true God. He is not a creature in any way.